All right, so today we are going on a deep dive into deontic logic, specifically the work of Ernst Mally, who way back in 1926, he made the first real attempt to, kind of like systematize this whole fascinating field.
Yeah, he was really a pioneer in this area. His book, The Basic Laws of Ought, Elements of the Logic of Willing, it was a huge effort to try to create a formal system for thinking about obligations and permissions and things that are forbidden.
So is it like instead of just saying you should do this or you shouldn't do that, he wanted to build a whole logic framework for like analyzing these oughts with mathematical precision?
That's exactly right. He was really trying to get at the essence of ethical reasoning in the symbolic language,
Yeah.
much like mathematicians, use symbols to represent quantities or relationships.
Okay, so this already sounds like it's going to be a real brain workout for me.
Yeah.
But before we get into like all the nitty-gritty details of his system, could you just remind us again, like at a high level, what is deontic logic all about? And why should we even why should we care about this stuff?
Well, deontic logic, it's really all about figuring out what we ought to do. So what's permissible and what's forbidden. So it's about understanding the logical structure of ethical statements
Mhm.
and the connections between different obligations. So, in a world where we just have tons of information and all this conflicting advice, deontic logic, I think, can really help us sort through, the complexities of moral decision making.
So it's kind of like a toolkit for untangling these ethical dilemmas,
Is
right?
it? Yeah, exactly. It gives us this framework for analyzing arguments, about morality and spotting inconsistencies and making more reasoned judgments about different situations.
Now, I've heard that Mally's system, while it was groundbreaking, it also led to some pretty strange, even paradoxical conclusions.
Hmm?
Can you give us a little as a sneak peek at what kind of went wrong?
Sure. So one of the more surprising outcomes of this system was the theorem that says if A requires B, then A requires everything that is true.
Wait, so how does that even make sense? So like if my cat requiring food means that it also like requires the existence of the universe, how does that like make any sense? Doesn't that just make the whole idea of requiring just meaningless?
You're exactly right. That's why this theorem was so perplexing. It seemed to say that any obligation, no matter how small, would automatically lead to just this infinite chain of other obligations, like encompassing literally every single truth in the universe.
Whoa, okay. Talk about a slippery slope. So where did Mally go wrong? Was it like a math error or were there like deeper philosophical issues at play?
It was really kind of like a combo of factors. So, Malley, he built his system on top of classical propositional logic, which, it's powerful, but it also has some quirks that can lead to these unexpected results when you try to apply it to these ideas about, obligation and permission.
So it's almost like you trying to, build this huge skyscraper on top of like a foundation of sand.
That's a good analogy. Yeah.
Hmm.
And he also made some specific choices in his axioms and definitions that seemed reasonable maybe at first, but then they ended up creating these strange kind of counterintuitive outcomes.
Okay, I'm definitely intrigued, but also a little intimidated.
Yeah.
Right. But before we dive into like all of these surprising theorems,
Hmm.
can we just take a step back and just understand the basics of how his system works?
Yeah.
Like how did he actually try to formalize like the whole idea of ought?
Sure. So Malley, he started with like the familiar symbols from, propositional logic. So like representing statements with letters like A, B, and C,
Yeah.
and connecting them with logical operators like and, or, and not.
Okay.
Um,
So far so good. That's, like the logic that I kind of vaguely remember from school.
yeah.
What did he add to that to represent the whole deontic concept?
So he brought in a few key symbols.
Uh-huh.
One of the most important ones was the exclamation mark, which, is just to mean ought. So instead of writing like it is obligatory to tell the truth, he would just write tell the truth.
So it's just like a shorthand for expressing those obligations.
Yeah, that's it.
Okay, I'm starting to get the picture now.
Yeah.
Did he have symbols for other deontic concepts like permission or prohibition?
Yeah, he did.
Okay.
But maybe for now, let's just focus on that ought symbol and how he used it in his axioms, like those fundamental rules of his system.
Okay, all right. So let's crack open those axioms and see what makes Mally's system tick.
Okay, great. So the first axiom is all about how obligations, they can be deduced logically.
Hmm.
It basically says if A requires B and B leads to C, then A also requires C.
That sounds pretty intuitive. Like, so if being a good student requires studying and studying leads to good grades, then being a good student also requires good grades.
That's exactly right. Yeah. It captures this idea that obligations can kind of chain together logically. If one thing requires another and that thing leads to something else, then the initial thing, it also requires that final outcome.
Hmm.
Okay, so his second axiom, it deals with combining different obligations. It says if A requires B and A also requires C, then A requires both B and C.
Okay. That also makes sense to me. So, like, if being healthy requires both eating well and it also requires exercising, then being healthy requires you to do both of those things,
Yeah,
not just one or the other.
exactly. Yeah, it's about, how you can group requirements together logically.
Okay.
And then his third axiom, this is where things get a little more complicated.
Oh,
It links this idea of requiring with the concept of obligation.
okay.
It says that A requires B if and only if it's obligatory that if A, then B.
Hmm. Okay. That one's a bit more difficult for me to grasp. Can you give me an example of how that works?
Sure. So let's say being a responsible citizen requires voting. Okay, so using this axiom, we can rephrase that as it's obligatory that if someone is a responsible citizen, then they vote.
So it's like saying the requirement to vote is kind of built into the definition of being a responsible citizen.
Yeah.
It's not just like a suggestion, it's like a logical consequence of that role.
Yeah, exactly. It formalizes how certain obligations are just kind of inherently tied to those specific rules or conditions.
Okay.
And then the fourth axiom, this is where things start to get really interesting and controversial.
Ooh, yeah.
So initially, Malley's fourth axiom, it just said, the unconditionally obligatory is obligatory, which, kind of seemed a little redundant, even to him.
Yeah, I could see how that, like, it wouldn't really add much to the system. It's like saying a square is a square.
Right.
So how did he end up refining that?
Well, later on, people who were interpreting his system, they replaced that with something a bit more potent.
Yeah, okay.
They said that the unconditionally obligatory is the case. And so it's written as like U, where U stands for the unconditionally obligatory.
Uh-huh.
And so what that means is that whatever is unconditionally obligatory, it just is true. Like it's a fact of reality.
Hold on a second. Isn't that kind of like blurring the lines between what is and what ought to be?
Yeah.
Like, if something is obligatory, does that automatically make
Yeah.
it true in the real world? That seems like it would lead to all sorts of philosophical problems.
Yeah, you're right to raise that concern. That's where we start to see some of the potential pitfalls of Malley's system.
Uh-huh.
By saying that the unconditionally obligatory is just the same as what's true, he really opened the door some very strange conclusions.
Okay, so I'm feeling like there's some storm clouds brewing on the horizon of deontic logic here.
Yeah.
But before we get to like all the fallout from that, can we just quickly cover his last axiom? What was his fifth and final principle?
Sure. So his fifth axiom, it says that the unconditionally obligatory does not require its own opposite. So basically, whatever that you represents, it can't also require not you.
So if U stands for like telling the truth, it can't also require you to lie. It has to be consistent with itself.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah.
okay.
It makes sure that the unconditionally obligatory doesn't contradict itself. But as we'll see, even with these seemingly reasonable axioms, Malley's system, it ends up generating some really puzzling, kind of head-scratching theorems.
This is where I get both fascinated and a little apprehensive.
Yeah.
Let's dive into these surprising theorems, shall we? What are some of the like eyebrow-raising outcomes of this system?
So one of the most startling is this theorem that you mentioned before. If A requires B, then A requires everything that is true.
Okay, let's unpack that a little bit. How on earth did he arrive at that conclusion? It just seems to defy common sense.
Right. So it comes from combining his first axiom, that one about deducing obligations,
Right.
with another theorem that he derived that says if A requires B, then A requires the verum. And the verum, in this context, it's just a fancy philosophical word for truth,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
It represents everything that's factually the case.
So by putting those two ideas together, he ended up with this idea that if A requires anything at all, it automatically requires everything that's true.
Yeah.
It's like saying if you're obligated to breathe, then you're also obligated to like ensure that the sun rises every morning. It doesn't make sense.
You're right. It seems absurd. And that's not the only head scratcher that his system came up with.
Oh, no.
So another surprising theorem was that the facts ought to be the case.
Whoa, now that one sounds really fatalistic.
Yeah.
Does that mean we just have to accept, like, every injustice, every tragedy, because they ought to be that way.
Yeah.
It just seems like a recipe for apathy, just giving up.
It's definitely a provocative statement and one that really highlights the potential dangers of, blurring the lines between is and ought.
Mm.
Malley's intention might have been to emphasize like this kind of acceptance of reality, but he kind of stumbled into a bit of a philosophical minefield with that one.
Yeah, it seems like his system, while it was ambitious, it kind of took a few wrong turns along the way, led to some ethically questionable conclusions.
Hmm.
Before we just dismiss his work entirely, though, are there any insights we can glean from it about where he might have gone wrong?
Yeah. So one key criticism came from Karl Menger, who was another philosopher.
Okay.
And he pointed out this fundamental flaw in Malley's system.
Okay.
He showed that in Malley's logic, A is obligatory if and only if A is actually the case.
Wait, so according to Malley, anything that's true is also obligatory, and vice versa.
That's right, yeah.
That totally collapses the distinction between those two concepts. It's like saying, the sky is blue, therefore we're obligated to make the sky blue.
Exactly. And as Menger argued, that really just makes the whole concept of ought meaningless. Like, why bother saying something ought to be the case if it's already true just by virtue of existing?
Yeah, I see the problem now. It makes ethical choice, like completely irrelevant. If everything that happens is already obligatory, then what's the point of even trying to make the world a better place?
That's the core of the critique, yeah.
Right.
Menger's analysis really showed this deep flaw in how Malley kind of connected those two concepts of truth and obligation.
Okay.
But, even though Malley's system had these really big issues, it's important to keep in mind that he was a pioneer in this whole field.
Yeah.
He was the first one to really try to create this formal system of deontic logic.
Mm-hmm.
And so his work, it really paved the way for future philosophers to, build on and refine those ideas.
So even if his specific system wasn't perfect, his attempt was still a really important step forward.
Totally, yeah.
Okay.
And all the criticisms that were made against the system, they weren't meant to dismiss the whole idea of deontic logic. They were kind of, in a way, a testament to how important the project was. They sparked this whole big debate, and they inspired other philosophers to find, different alternative ways to try to formalize ethical reasoning.
So Malley's work, even in its, imperfections, it was like a catalyst for progress in the field of deontic logic.
Yeah,
Okay.
it's like a scientific experiment where, even if you don't get the results you were hoping for, it still helps to advance our understanding.
That's really interesting. It's like we're seeing the evolution of thought in real time.
Yeah.
But before we move on to those alternative approaches, I have one more question about Malley's system.
Sure.
We've talked a lot about the ought symbol, but didn't he also have symbols for permission and prohibition?
He did, yeah. He used P for permission and F for prohibition. But his treatment of those concepts, it wasn't quite as developed as his focus on obligation.
Uh-huh.
And as you might guess, those concepts also led to some peculiar outcomes within his system.
Okay, I think I'm starting to understand why his work caused such a stir in the philosophy world. It was this bold attempt to try to bring logical rigor to ethics, but it also showed just how complex and slippery these concepts really are.
Exactly, yeah. And that's what makes deontic logic such a fascinating and challenging area.
Right.
It's about trying to capture the essence of moral reasoning in this formal system, but at the same time acknowledging that those very concepts might, kind of resist being neatly categorized within a system like that.
It's almost like trying to map the human heart using a compass and a ruler.
Mm.
There's a certain beauty and elegance to the attempt, but it can only capture a limited aspect of that complexity.
Yeah, that's a great analogy.
Yeah.
And it really shows why, even today, deontic logic is still an area of active debate. People
Yeah.
are still refining these ideas.
So where do we go from here? Having seen all the limitations of Malley's approach, what are some of the other paths that philosophers have explored to build more robust, more intuitive systems of deontic logic? Okay, so we've seen how Malley's attempt to, put ought into a system, how that led to some pretty wild conclusions, right?
Yeah.
And it seems like he maybe took a wrong turn somewhere trying to force this really complex concept into this rigid logical box.
Yeah.
Where did philosophers go from there? Did they give up on this whole idea of deontic logic?
No, they didn't give up on the project. What they did is they took Malley's work as a starting point, And they started to look at different ways of approaching the problem that might avoid those paradoxical outcomes.
So they kind of saw it as a valuable lesson, like a what not to do when
Yeah.
building a system.
Yeah, exactly. And one of the big realizations they had was that just relying on classical propositional logic, that might not be the best way to build a system of deontic logic.
Hmm. Why is that? What's so tricky about classical logic when it comes to, like, talking about ethics?
Well, classical logic, it really emphasizes truth and falsity.
Uh-huh.
And that can lead to some weird results when you apply it to like obligation, permission, these kinds of concepts.
Right.
Remember that theorem, like if A requires B, then A requires everything that's true.
Right, right.
That's a perfect example of how classical logic can just go off the rails when you try to use it for oughts.
Yeah, it's like trying to, I don't know, measure the depth of the ocean using a ruler that's meant for, like, measuring fabric. Like, the tool just isn't the right fit for the job.
Right, exactly.
So what did they try instead? Like, were there other kinds of logic that seemed more promising?
Yeah, so one alternative that people got really interested in was relevance logic.
Okay.
And this kind of logic, it focuses on making sure that when you make a logical inference, it's actually relevant to the premises you're starting with.
Mm.
So you avoid those like anything goes conclusions that we saw in Malley's system.
So with relevance logic, we wouldn't get those crazy scenarios where, like, my cat requiring food means it also requires, like, the existence of black holes, right?
Yeah, exactly. Relevance logic, it helps to create a more like grounded, intuitive system
Okay.
where those obligations are much more tied to the specific conditions that make them relevant.
Relevance logic, I like the sound of that.
Mm.
It seems much more in line with how we actually think about ethics in our everyday lives.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Were there any other, like, contenders in this race to build a better deontic logic?
Yeah. So another really fascinating approach is what's called intuitionistic logic.
Right.
And this system, it actually challenges some of the most basic assumptions of classical logic.
Uh-oh.
Like, for example, the law of excluded middle, which says that, every proposition has to be either true or false.
Wait, are you saying there's a logic where things can be neither true nor false? Now, that's a real mind bender. How does that even work?
Well, intuitionistic logic, it doesn't necessarily like reject the law of excluded middle entirely. It just takes a more nuanced approach.
Right.
It really focuses on what you can prove constructively.
Okay.
So in this logic, you only say something is true if you can actually show that it's true, not just argue that it can't be false.
So it looks about, like, some abstract truth and more about what we can actually, demonstrate and justify.
Yeah.
That actually seems very relevant to ethics, where, we're often dealing with these very messy situations, competing values.
Exactly, exactly. And so when you apply intuitionistic logic to deontic logic, it can help you avoid some of those more paradoxical results that you get with Malley's system, while still allowing for a rigorous way to explore those ethical concepts.
Interesting. So by switching to, relevance logic or intuitionistic logic, philosophers could kind of sidestep those weird theorems that Malley ended up with. It's
Yeah.
like they were fixing the bugs in his system by, like, changing the underlying code, right?
That's a great way to put it, yeah.
Right.
They were trying to build a more stable, reliable foundation for deontic logic, one that wouldn't just collapse under the weight of these counterintuitive conclusions.
But switching to a whole different type of logic seems like a pretty drastic measure.
Yeah.
Were there any, like, less radical ways to fix the issues in Malley's system?
Yeah, there were. Some philosophers, they took a more incremental approach.
Okay.
They focused on like refining Malley's original axioms and definitions.
Oh.
And they realized that just by tweaking those rules, they could actually create a system that's much closer to what we call today like standard deontic logic,
Okay.
or KD.
So instead of throwing out the whole system, they were just, like, fine-tuning it.
Yeah.
Like a software update for Malley's deontic logic.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
And it turned out that even like small changes to his original axioms could have a big impact on the kinds of theorems that the system produced. By just slightly changing how those requires and ought symbols were defined, they could avoid those really outlandish conclusions and create a system that's more in line with our like intuitive sense of what obligation means.
Fascinating. It shows how even these tiny changes to, like, the foundation of a logical system, how those can have, like, ripple effects throughout its entire structure.
Yeah.
Changing the very conclusions it can reach. So looking back, what can we say about Malley's legacy? Was he ultimately, like, a failure or a success?
Oh, I think he was definitely a success.
Okay.
Even if his, specific system wasn't perfect, he was the first person to really try to formalize deontic logic. He
Yeah.
was a real pioneer who, opened up this whole new field of philosophical inquiry.
It's like he was trying to create the ethical equivalent of like calculus.
Yeah.
He may not have gotten all the details right, but he showed that it was possible to analyze these moral concepts with, like, mathematical rigor.
Exactly. And without his pioneering work, we wouldn't have this rich and diverse field of deontic logic that we have today.
Okay.
His system, even with its flaws, it was a crucial step towards the more sophisticated and nuanced systems that we use now.
So in a way, his biggest contribution wasn't the specific system that he built, but the fact that he even tried to build one at all.
Right.
He showed that ought could be, like, analyzed logically, even if capturing its full essence was way more challenging than he initially thought it would be.
Yeah, exactly. And all the criticisms that his system received, those weren't a sign of failure. They were more like a testament to how important and complex the work was that he was doing.
Right.
And it inspired, tons of other philosophers to take up the challenge and continue refining those tools of deontic logic.
So are modern deontic logics totally immune to those weird paradoxes that Malley ran into? Have we finally figured out, like, the code of ethical reasoning?
Well, we've come a long way in addressing those problems. But deontic logic, it's still a very active area of research. There's still lots of debate.
Right.
And, new challenges and new paradoxes, they keep popping up as we try to apply these logical tools to increasingly complex ethical dilemmas.
So it's like any scientific field.
Yeah.
There's always more to discover, more to refine, more to question. But that's what makes it so exciting.
Exactly. Yeah. Deontic logic is this really vibrant and evolving field, It keeps pushing the boundaries of how we understand and reason about our ethical obligations.
Speaking of real-world implications,
Yeah.
aside from helping philosophers, figure out these theoretical puzzles, does deontic logic have any practical applications in our lives?
Yeah.
Is it just an academic exercise, or can it actually make a difference in how we make decisions?
Yeah, so deontic logic has implications that go way beyond just, academics.
Okay.
One area where it's proving to be really important is in computer science,
Mhm.
particularly in the development of artificial intelligence.
That makes sense. If we want to build AI systems that can make, good ethical decisions, we need to give them some way to understand what ought means in different situations.
Exactly, yeah. Deontic logic, it gives us a language for specifying those moral rules and principles that can guide AI's decision-making in really complex situations. It helps us translate these really abstract ethical concepts into a format that, machines can actually work with.
So instead of just blindly following instructions, AI could actually use deontic logic to, like, reason about its obligations and make more ethically informed choices.
Yeah.
That's a really cool idea, but it's also a bit intimidating.
Yeah.
Raises a lot of questions about how we program those ethical principles into machines in the first place.
Right, exactly. It's a field with huge potential, but also, big ethical challenges. How do we make sure that the moral principles that we embed in these AI systems, how do we make sure that they actually align with our values?
Right.
And how do we deal with cases where those principles might conflict with each other? These are questions that philosophers and computer scientists are wrestling with right now.
It seems like deontic logic isn't just about, this abstract theorizing anymore.
Yeah.
It's actually becoming more and more relevant to the technologies that are shaping our world. It's a good reminder that philosophy, even in its most abstract forms, can have a huge impact on our lives.
Definitely. And as we keep developing these more and more sophisticated AI systems, deontic logic is going to be even more important in making sure that those systems are aligned with our values, and that they're helping to create a better future.
So to kind of wrap things up here, we've covered a lot of ground today, from, like, the historical roots of deontic logic all the way to its, modern day applications in AI. It's been a really fascinating deep dive into this world of oughts and obligations. What's the key takeaway here for our listeners? Why should they care about deontic logic?
Well, whether we realize it or not, we all use deonic reasoning every day. Every time we make a choice based on what we think we should do, we're using those principles of deontic logic, even if we're not consciously aware of it.
So it's not just like some obscure philosophical concept. It's actually baked into how we make moral decisions.
Exactly. And, understanding those principles can help us become more aware of our own ethical reasoning.
Okay.
Maybe spot inconsistencies or biases in the way we think
Right.
and make better, more thoughtful choices. It can even help us understand the ethical implications of those new technologies that are changing the world so quickly.
It's like getting this behind-the-scenes look at the ethical machinery of our minds
Yeah.
and the systems that we build. And that awareness can be really powerful. It lets us take more control of our choices and try to shape a world that actually aligns with our values.
That's a great way to put it. Deontic logic, it's not just about abstract rules and symbols. It's about understanding what it means to be like a responsible and ethical person in a complex world.
Well, on that note, thank you so much for taking us on this deep dive into deontic logic. It's been really eye-opening.
Yeah, it's been my pleasure. And to our listeners, I just say, keep exploring deontic logic. It's a journey with lots of challenges and surprises, but ultimately, I think it can help us understand ourselves better, our obligations to others, and the kind of world we want to live in.
And that wraps up another episode of The Deep Dive. Until next time, keep those minds curious and keep thinking critically.